Hey guys, we think we know the Victorian era from the movies, but the truth is a lot dirtier. Today, sewers are just pipes for waste. Back then, they were an entire underground economy and workplace. You had people called toshers who spent their days panning for gold in human waste. Kids called mudlarks dug through river mud just to find scraps of coal to sell. Pure finders actually spent all day hunting for dog poop to sell to leather makers. Even the rat catchers were in on it, breeding their own rats so they could turn them in for extra cash. I'm just a guy reading stories on the internet. Hit subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. What time is it, and where are you listening from tonight? Let's get right into the dirt. So we're talking about dirt, but not just the kind you find under your fingernails after a day in the garden. We're talking about London in the 1850s. At this point in history, London was the biggest, busiest city on the planet. It was the center of everything, but it had a massive problem that nobody wanted to talk about. To understand how some people made a living in the sewers, you have to understand just how disgusting the city actually was. Think about the numbers for a second. In 1801, London had about 1 million people. That is a lot of people for that time. But then things went crazy. By 1851, that number hit nearly 2.5 million. The city more than doubled its population in just 50 years. People were pouring in from the countryside every single day, looking for work in the new factories. The city was growing faster than anyone could keep up with. They were building houses and shops as fast as they could, but they forgot one thing. They forgot to build a way to get rid of the waste. I'm not just talking about trash, I'm talking about everything. Back then, most houses didn't have a toilet like you and I have. They had something called a cesspool. It was basically just a big brick-lined hole in the ground. Sometimes it was in the backyard, but a lot of the time it was right under the floorboards of the house. Every time you used a bucket or a primitive toilet, it went straight into that hole. Here is the catch. These holes weren't connected to anything. They just sat there and filled up. You were supposed to pay a guy to come and shovel it out in the middle of the night, but that was expensive. Most people couldn't afford it. So what did they do? They just let them fill up. Eventually, the waste would start soaking into the ground. It would leak through the basement walls. In the poorest parts of the city, some houses had 2 or 3 feet of raw waste just sitting in the cellar. People lived right on top of it. Then the city tried to fix it, but they actually made it worse. They started building drains under the streets, but these drains weren't meant for human waste. They were just pipes to carry rainwater away so the streets wouldn't flood. But people are people. They saw a pipe and they figured it was a great place to dump their buckets. Pretty soon, everyone was connecting their house drains to these rainwater pipes. And where did those pipes go? You guessed it, they went straight into the River Thames. Every bit of waste from millions of people went right into the water. And I mean everything. But it wasn't just the people. London was full of slaughterhouses back then. There were no big refrigerated trucks, so they had to kill the animals right there in the middle of the city. I want you to imagine thousands of cows and sheep being killed every single day in the middle of town. The butchers didn't have a trash service. They just took all the blood, the fat, and the guts and hosed them into the gutters. All of that animal waste washed down the street and straight into the river. Then you had the factories. London was the heart of the industrial world. They were making leather, glue, and chemicals. These factories had huge pipes that pumped out acids and dyes. They didn't ask permission. They just dumped it all into the Thames. The river became a thick, black soup. And here is the worst part. The Thames is a tidal river. That means the water doesn't just flow one way out to the sea. The ocean pushes the water back up into the city twice a day. So all that waste didn't just wash away. It just moved up and down the city. It sat there, getting thicker and more bloated every day. It got so bad that the water actually started to turn into a kind of paste. Now, if you were rich, you could move to the edges of the city where the air was a little better. But if you were poor, you were stuck. These were basically slums where the buildings were falling apart. You'd have a whole family, maybe a mom, a dad, and 5 kids, all living in one single tiny room. There was no privacy and definitely no clean water. These houses were built right on top of each other. The alleys were so narrow you could touch the walls on both sides. And right in the middle of those alleys, there was usually an open ditch. That ditch was the neighborhood sewer. It didn't move. It just sat there, full of everything the neighbors threw out. People had to step over it to get to their front door. They'd hang their laundry over it. They'd eat their dinner while the smell came through the cracks in the floor. It was a nightmare. But for some people, this mess was an opportunity. While everyone else was trying to look away from the filth, a whole group of people decided to go right into the middle of it. They realized that in a city this big, people drop things, they lose things, and all of those things, the gold, the silver, the metal, all of it ends up in the same place. It ends up in the dirt. And that is where our story really starts, with the people who were brave enough or desperate enough to go looking for treasure in the worst place on earth. So we're talking about the dirt, and I really want you to think about that word for a second. In a city like Victorian London, dirt wasn't just something you wiped off your shoes. It was a boundary. On one side, you had the people who had enough money to pretend the mess didn't exist. On the other side, you had millions of people who lived and breathed it every single day. London was basically 2 different worlds living right on top of each other. If you had money, you lived in a house with high ceilings and fancy furniture. You bought things, you used them, and then you threw them away. But for the people on the bottom, that trash was the only way they could stay alive. One man's garbage was literally another man's dinner. It created this weird, hidden economy that ran underneath the feet of the rich, and most of them never even noticed it was there. There was this one guy who did notice, though. His name was Henry Mayhew. He was a journalist, but he wasn't interested in the usual stuff like politics or the lives of the royals. He wanted to know how the people in the shadows actually made it through the week. So he went out and did something that most people in his social circle thought was crazy. He actually talked to them. He spent years walking through the worst parts of the city, sitting down with people covered in grime and asking them, "How do you do it?" He ended up writing this massive collection of interviews called London Labor and the London Poor. It's a huge book, and it's basically a field guide to a world that doesn't exist anymore. Mayhew didn't look down on these people. He treated them like they were part of a giant machine. Now, street finder might sound like a nice hobby, but I'm telling you, it was a brutal, full-time job. A street finder was anyone who spent their entire life looking at the ground. They weren't beggars, and they weren't thieves. They were workers. They saw value where everyone else saw filth. If you walked past a pile of old rags or a dead horse in the street, you saw a problem or a bad smell. A street finder saw a week's worth of rent. The whole system operated on one very strict rule. Nothing gets thrown away. I mean absolutely nothing. In our world today, we toss things in a plastic bin and they just disappear. We don't think about where it goes. In Victorian London, that was a luxury no one could afford. If a piece of metal fell off a carriage, someone was there to grab it before the dust even settled. If a cigar butt hit the pavement, it was picked up in seconds. They had this mindset that everything, no matter how gross or small, could be turned back into money. It was the world's most intense recycling program, but it wasn't driven by an interest in the environment. It was driven by pure, raw hunger. So who was buying all this junk? You'd think it was just other poor people, but that's the real secret of this economy. It was the big factories. See, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. These massive plants were popping up all over the city, and they were hungry for raw materials. They realized it was way cheaper to buy recycled waste from a street finder than it was to buy brand new materials from somewhere else. Let's look at how that actually worked. Take old rags, for example. A street finder would spend all day picking up scraps of cloth from the gutters. They'd wash them as best they could and sell them to a middleman. That middleman would sell them to a warehouse, and the warehouse would sell them to a paper mill. Those dirty rags were eventually turned into high-quality paper, the paper that the rich people used to write their fancy letters. Probably started its life as a discarded shirt in a muddy alleyway. It wasn't just rags either. They looked for bones. Why? Because factories could grind them down to make glue or fertilizer. They even looked for dog droppings. I know, it sounds disgusting, and it was, but tanneries needed it to process leather. Without guys literally picking up dog poop off the street, the rich couldn't have their fancy leather boots or carriage seats. Mayhew found people who specialized in every little niche you can imagine. Some people only looked for old tea leaves. They'd dry them out, dye them, and sell them again. They would pull the leftover tobacco out of the butts and sell it to shops that made cheap cigarettes for the poor. It was a perfect loop. The rich smoked the cigars, threw them away, the poor picked them up, and the factories turned them back into something the poor could actually afford to buy. Every single piece of waste was a link in a giant chain that kept the whole city running. The street finders were the ones at the very bottom, doing the heavy lifting. They were the ones who made sure that the secret economy never stopped moving. They didn't have much, but they had a sharp eye for what everyone else missed. They knew that if you looked hard enough in the dirt, you could always find a way to survive for one more day. And it all started with a simple question. What did someone else throw away? That question was answered by a group of people we now call the mudlarks. If you were standing on the banks of the Thames River back then, you would see them everywhere, but you wouldn't think they were part of a massive economy. To you, they just looked like moving piles of rags. Most of these people were just children. I'm talking kids as young as 5 or 6 years old. Along with them were the old men, guys who were too slow or too weak to work in the factories or on the docks anymore. They didn't have a choice. If you couldn't find a job and you didn't want to end up in the workhouse, you went to the river. The river was their boss, and the tide was their time clock. They had to wait for the water to pull back. Twice a day, the Thames would retreat and leave behind miles of thick black mud. That was the signal. As soon as the water stayed low, hundreds of these mudlarks would climb down the slippery stone stairs or just slide down the banks into the muck. They didn't have boots. Most went barefoot. Think about that for a second. They were walking through freezing cold mud that was filled with broken glass, jagged pieces of metal, and all the waste of a city with no real plumbing. If you got a cut on your foot back then, it wasn't just a nuisance. It could kill you. But they kept walking. because they couldn't afford to stop. They would spend hours hunched over, staring at the ground. They weren't looking for treasure, at least not the kind you'd find in a movie. They were looking for the small stuff. The first thing they always looked for was coal. London ran on coal, and huge barges moved it up and down the river every single day. Workers were messy. When they loaded the barges, coal fell off. When they unloaded them, more coal fell off. The mudlarks would scoop these black nuggets out of the mud and drop them into an old hat or a greasy bag they tied around their waist. Next, they looked for rope. Shipping was the biggest business in the city, and ships used miles of heavy rope. When a rope got old or frayed, sailors just cut it off and threw it overboard. The mudlarks would pull these heavy, wet strands out of the sludge. Even a small piece was worth something, because it could be pulled apart and turned into oakum, which was used to plug the gaps in wooden ships to keep them from leaking. The real prize, though, was metal. Copper was the big one. Ships back then had copper sheets on their hulls to protect the wood. Sometimes those sheets would tear, or a copper nail would fall out. If a kid found a piece of copper, that was a huge win. They also looked for iron, lead, or even old bones. People used bones to make glue or fertilizer, so even a dead animal's rib had a price tag on it. They didn't have bags to put this stuff in, usually. They used their aprons or the folds of their shirts. They would walk for miles in the knee-deep mud, bending down every few seconds to grab a piece of trash. They did this until the tide started to come back in. You couldn't mess around with the tide. If you stayed too long, the water would trap you against a wall and drown you. It happened more often than you'd think. Once the water forced them out, they had to turn that trash into cash. They didn't go to a bank. They went to the rag and bone shops or the marine store dealers. These shops were usually tucked away in the narrow, dark alleys near the water. The shopkeepers were tough people who didn't give anything away for free. A mudlark would walk in, covered in stinking river mud, and dump their pile on the counter. The dealer would look it over and give them a price. It was never a lot. On an average day, a kid might make about 3 pence. I want to put that number in perspective for you. 3 pennies sounds like nothing, but back then, a loaf of bread cost about 2 pence. If you were lucky and found a lot of coal or a nice piece of copper, you might make 4 or 5 pence. That was enough to buy a bit of food and pay for a spot in a crowded rooming house where you slept on the floor with 10 other people. If you had a bad day and found nothing, you didn't eat. You just waited for the tide to go back out so you could try again. They were at the very bottom of the ladder. No one respected them. No one protected them. Most people in London didn't even want to look at them because they smelled like the river. But here is the thing you have to understand. These kids and old men were the city's unofficial cleaning crew. They took the things that the big industries threw away and they put them back into the system. They found value where everyone else saw a mess. They weren't just scavengers. They were the smallest gears in a massive machine that kept the Victorian economy moving, one piece of wet coal at a time. They didn't do it because they wanted to save the environment. They did it because if they didn't, they wouldn't survive the night. And while the mudlarks were working the mud, another group was looking even deeper. They were going inside the city itself. You see, while the mudlarks were down there freezing their toes off in the Thames, you had this other group of people working right under everyone's noses on the city streets. They weren't looking for lost coins or pieces of scrap metal. They were looking for something much more common, and honestly, a lot more disgusting. They called themselves pure finders. Now, when you hear the word pure, you probably think of something clean, like a fresh glass of water or a new sheet of paper. But in Victorian London, pure was just a polite way of saying dog poop. That was their whole business. They spent every single day, from sunrise to sunset, walking the streets with a bucket and a small scoop, looking for dog droppings. You might wonder why anyone would do that. I mean, it sounds like the worst job you could possibly imagine. But there was a real functioning market for this stuff. London was the leather capital of the world back then. Everyone wore leather boots, everyone used leather saddles, and the wealthy sat on leather carriage seats. But before a raw animal hide can become a soft, flexible piece of leather, it has to go through a process called tanning, and that's where the dog poop came in. The tanneries needed it because it contained certain chemicals that helped break down the skins. It would pull out the lime used in the earlier stages of cleaning and make the leather soft and supple. Without the pure, your fancy new boots would be as stiff and brittle as a piece of dry wood. So the pure finders were basically the backbone of the fashion industry, even if nobody wanted to invite them to dinner. If you were a pure finder, your day started early. You'd grab a wooden bucket, usually one with a tight lid to keep the smell from driving you crazy, and you'd head out. You didn't just walk randomly, though. You had a route. You'd try to hit the wealthier neighborhoods first, places like Mayfair or Belgravia. There was a reason for that. Rich people fed their dogs better food, often meat and bones, which meant the waste was higher quality for the tanners. It was usually more alkaline, which is what the leather workers wanted. As you walked, you had to keep your eyes glued to the ground. You were looking under carriage wheels, near the edges of alleyways, and around the lamp posts. When you found a pile, you'd scoop it up. If you were lucky, you had a small black glove to protect your hand, but a lot of these folks just used their bare fingers. They couldn't afford to be picky. You'd drop it in the bucket and keep moving. It was a race, really. You weren't the only one out there. If you saw another finder on your street, you'd have to speed up or find a new block before they cleared out all the profit. The goal for the day was always the same. You had to hit your quota. The leather yards didn't buy this stuff by the handful. They wanted bulk. You were looking to fill that bucket several times over if you could. Most of these finders would walk 10 or 15 miles a day, zigzagging through the city, just to get enough to make the trip to the tanneries worth it. The main hub for all of this was a place called Bermondsey. It was a rough neighborhood south of the river, packed with huge, stinking factories where they processed the hides. When you finally reached the gates of a tannery in Bermondsey, you'd have to sell your haul. This was the moment of truth. The buyers there were tough. They'd look at what you brought in and judge the quality. If it was limey, meaning it was white and dry, you could get a better price. That was the premium stuff. If it was dark and wet, they might pay you less or turn you away entirely. On average, you were looking to get about 8 pence to a shilling for a full bucket. To give you an idea of what that meant, a shilling could buy you a couple of loaves of bread and maybe a pint of beer. It was just enough to keep you alive so you could go out and do it all over again the next morning. It's a strange thing to think about. You had hundreds of people, many of them older women who couldn't find work anywhere else, serving as a sort of unofficial cleaning crew for the city. The city didn't pay them a cent to keep the streets clear of filth. The market took care of that. The demand for leather created a demand for waste, and that demand kept the poorest people in London from starving. They were part of a giant machine. The rich people's dogs provided the raw material, the finders provided the labor, and the tanneries turned it all into luxury goods. It was a perfect circle of survival, fueled by the stuff everyone else was trying their best to step over. They didn't do it because they liked it. They did it because every bucket brought them closer to a warm meal. And as long as Londoners wanted soft leather gloves, the pier finders would be out there, buckets in hand, scouring the cobblestones. But don't think for a second that dog poop was the only thing people were fighting over on those streets. If you walked just one block over, you'd run into someone else with a massive, greasy sack slung over their shoulder. These were the bone pickers and the rag gatherers. They were the backbone of a recycling system that London didn't even know it had. You have to understand that back then, nothing was truly useless. If you threw something away, someone else was right there to pick it up and turn it into a penny. Let's talk about the rags first. You and I think of paper as something that comes from trees. We have giant mills that chew up wood pulp and spit out reams of white paper. But in Victorian London, that technology didn't exist yet. If you wanted to print a newspaper or a book or even a simple banknote, you needed cloth. Specifically, you needed cotton and linen. Every single page of every book you would find in a rich man's library started out as someone's old shirt or a discarded bedsheet. Because of this, rags were like gold. The paper mills were constantly hungry for them. They couldn't get enough. So the rag gatherers would spend their entire day looking for any scrap of fabric they could find. They didn't care if it was soaked in mud or covered in grease. They'd pull it out of the gutter, shake it off, and toss it into their bag. They weren't just looking for big pieces either. Even a tiny strip of linen was worth a fraction of a farthing. By the end of the day, those fractions added up to a loaf of bread. Then you had the bones. This sounds a bit gross to us now, but the bone trade was massive. Think about how much meat people ate. Even the poor tried to get a bit of mutton or beef when they could. Once the meat was gone, the bones went into the trash. But the bone pickers, or bone grubbers as people called them, knew those bones were worth a lot to the right people. They would haul these heavy bags of bones to local factories. These places were usually tucked away in the nastiest parts of town because they smelled terrible. One type of factory would take the bones and boil them down in huge vats. They were looking for the fat and grease still trapped inside. That fat was a key ingredient for making soap. So that bar of soap a wealthy lady used to wash her hands might have started as a muddy bone pulled out of a ditch by a guy who hadn't eaten in 2 days. If the bones were too dry for soap, the factories would grind them up into a fine powder instead. This bone dust was sold to farmers all over the country. It was one of the best fertilizers they had. It helped grow the crops that fed the city. It was this perfect, dirty circle. The city produced waste, the bone pickers gathered it, the factories processed it, and the farms used it to grow more food to send back into the city. The life of a gatherer wasn't easy. I want you to imagine the physical toll this took. These people didn't have carts. Most of them didn't even have decent shoes. They carried everything on their backs. A full sack of wet rags and heavy bones could easily weigh 50 or 60 pounds. Now imagine carrying that weight while you walk 10 or 15 miles a day. Their route was very specific. They didn't just wander around aimlessly. That's where the money was. The rich people lived there, and rich people were wasteful. They threw away better rags and bigger bones. A gatherer would show up just as the sun was coming up, beating the trash collectors to the curb. They'd pick through the piles outside the big mansions, moving fast so the police wouldn't move them along. Once the bags were half full, they'd start the long trek back toward the East End. That's where the marine store dealers were. These were the middlemen. They sat in dark, cramped shops filled to the ceiling with junk. The gatherer would walk in, dump their bag on a scale, and pray the dealer was feeling honest that day. The dealer would look at the quality of the rags. He'd check if the bones were fresh or if they were too old to be useful. The pay was pathetic. You might get a few pennies for a whole day of back-breaking work. But in London, a few pennies was the difference between sleeping in a bed and sleeping under a bridge. It was the difference between a bowl of hot soup and a growling stomach. You also have to realize how competitive this was. You weren't the only person looking for rags. There were thousands of people doing this. If you saw a piece of cloth in the distance, you didn't walk toward it, you ran. If you found a good spot, like a trash heap behind a hotel, you kept it a secret. You'd see these gatherers dodging carriages and pushing through crowds, always looking down. They never looked at the sky, they never looked at the famous buildings. Their eyes were locked on the ground, searching for that dull white glint of a bone or the flash of a dirty rag. They were basically human filters. They moved through the city and strained out anything that had even a tiny bit of value. Without them, the city would have literally choked on its own filth. The trash would have just piled up until the streets were impassable. But because there was a market for this stuff, because paper mills needed shirts and soap factories needed bones, these people kept the gears of the city turning. They didn't do it because they cared about the environment. They didn't do it to be helpful. They did it because they were part of a hidden economy. It was a world where a discarded rib bone from a Sunday roast was a currency. Every step they took, every heavy bag they hauled, and every mile they walked was about survival. They took the things the rest of the world hated and turned them into a life. And while the bone pickers were scouring the surface for scraps, another group was looking even deeper. They knew that if you really wanted to find the stuff London lost, you had to go where the water went. So you've got these bone pickers on the surface, right? They're just scratching at the dirt, hoping to find a bit of metal or some old rags. But if you really wanted to make the kind of money that changed your life, you had to go down. You had to become a tosher. Now these guys were the absolute kings of the London underworld, and I mean that literally. While everyone else was fighting over a piece of old rope on the street, the toshers were wading through the city's guts. They were the top tier, the elite. Think of them like the special forces of the Victorian gutter. They didn't just walk into the sewers, though. It wasn't like they had a front door key. Most of London's sewers back then were a complete mess of old brick pipes and ancient tunnels. As the city grew, people just built right on top of them and covered them up. To get inside, these guys had to be smart. They'd wait for the tide to go out on the Thames. When the river water dropped, it would reveal these huge gaping holes in the mud along the shore. Those were the sewer outlets. They'd crawl right into those holes while the rest of the city was sleeping. Sometimes they'd even pry up a manhole cover in a dark alleyway if they knew a specific spot was full of good stuff. But the river was their main highway. They worked at night mostly. You have to remember, what they were doing was actually illegal. The government didn't want people down there because it was dangerous, and frankly, they didn't want people knowing what was flowing under their feet. But the toshers didn't care about the law. The money was just too good to stay away. Now, you couldn't just walk into a sewer in your normal clothes. If you did that, you'd be dead or sick in a day. You needed specific gear. First off, they wore these heavy canvas trousers. These weren't for style. They were coated in fat or grease to make them somewhat waterproof. They were thick enough to stop a rat from biting through to your skin. And you have to understand, the rats down there weren't like the ones you see in a park. They were huge, they were hungry, and they were mean. If you got a cut in that water, you were finished. So those trousers were your first line of defense. Next, every tosher carried a long pole. It was usually about 7 or 8 feet long. At the end of it, they had a heavy iron hoe. This was their most important tool. They used it to poke through the muck and the sludge to find coins, silver spoons, or bits of jewelry that had fallen through the cracks in the street above. But the pole was for more than just digging. They used it to test the ground in front of them. The bottom of a sewer isn't flat. It's full of pits and soft spots. If you stepped into a hole without checking it first, you might sink into 3 feet of human waste and never come back up. The pole was their lifeline. They lean on it like a cane to keep their balance on the slick bricks. Finally, they had their lanterns. You couldn't use a regular candle or a torch down there. That was a great way to blow yourself up. Instead, they used these early versions of battery-powered lanterns, were very specific lamps that were shielded. They didn't carry these in their hands, though. They strapped them right to their chests. That way, both of their hands stayed free to work the hoe and bag whatever treasure they found. Imagine seeing a guy coming at you in a dark, narrow tunnel with a glowing light on his chest and a giant iron hook in his hand. You'd think you were looking at a monster. But even with the right gear, the job was basically a death trap every single shift. The first thing that could kill you was the river itself. Since they entered through the river outlets, they were at the mercy of the tides. If you were half a mile deep into a brick tunnel and the tide started coming in, you were in big trouble. You'd hear it first. It sounded like a freight train coming towards you through the pipes. That was the Thames pushing back into the city. There was nowhere to hide. The walls were covered in slime and grease, so you couldn't just climb up. If you didn't get back to the entrance or find a ladder to the street in time, the water would rise until it hit the ceiling. You'd be pinned against the bricks, and you'd drown in the dark, miles away from anyone who could hear you. If the water didn't get you, the air would. These tunnels were stuffed with rotting waste from millions of people. When that stuff sits, it creates gas. It was basically just a pocket of air with zero oxygen in it. You wouldn't smell it, and you wouldn't see it. You'd just be walking along, feel a little bit tired, and then you'd just drop dead on the spot. Your friends would find you later, looking like you were just taking a nap. Then there was the explosive gas. Methane would build up in the dead ends of the tunnels. It only took one spark. Maybe a lantern wasn't sealed right, or maybe a metal hoe hit a piece of flint in the wall. Boom! The whole tunnel would turn into a giant cannon. It happened more often than people like to admit. You'd be walking down a street in London, and suddenly a manhole cover would fly 50 feet into the air because some poor guy a mile away hit a rock with his shovel. So why did they do it? Why risk drowning or blowing up every night? People in Victorian London were messy. They dropped coins down the drains. They lost rings while washing their hands. They threw old bits of copper and lead away. All of that stuff washed down into the sewers and got caught in the cracks of the old brick work. A lucky tosher could find more money in one night than a regular laborer could make in a month. They were finding gold sovereigns, silver cutlery, and piles of scrap metal that they could sell to the yards. They would work in small groups, usually 2 or 3 men. They had to trust each other, because if one guy got stuck or his light went out, he was as good as dead without his partners. They moved slow, sweeping their hose through the filth, listening for the clink of metal against metal. Every time they heard that sound, it was like winning the lottery. They'd scoop the prize into a heavy bag tied to their waist and keep moving. They'd stay down there for hours, wading through waist-deep water, breathing in fumes that would make a normal person vomit in seconds. They didn't see it as a disgusting job, though. They saw it as a business. They knew the map of the tunnels better than the people who built them. They knew which pipes led to the rich neighborhoods and which ones weren't worth the walk. If you lived in a fancy house in the West End, a tosher probably knew exactly what you were flushing away. By the time the sun started to come up, they'd head back toward the river. They'd crawl out of those pipes covered in the worst grime you can imagine and head home to count their take. They were dirty, they smelled terrible, and they were constantly hacking up lungs full of sewer dust, but they had pockets full of silver. While the rest of the city was just waking up to go work 12 hours in a factory for pennies, the toshers were heading to bed with a small fortune. They took the risks no one else would, and because of that, they owned the tunnels. They were the only ones brave enough or desperate enough to go where the water went. So, you're standing there in the dark, knee-deep in whatever London decided to wash away that morning. You've got your lantern strapped to your chest and a long pole in your hand. You aren't just wandering around, you're hunting. You see, the sewers weren't just pipes for waste. They were a massive underground gold mine if you knew where to look. Think about what happens when a city of millions of people lives their lives on cobblestone streets. People lose things. They drop a coin while reaching for a handkerchief. A maid accidentally knocks a silver spoon into the dishwater and just watches it slide down the drain. All of that stuff eventually ends up in the same place. It flows into the dark. And because metal is heavy, it doesn't just float out to the river. It sinks. It gets caught in the cracks of the bricks. It settles in the thick black mud at the bottom of the tunnels. The first thing you'd be looking for wasn't actually gold. It was copper, specifically copper nails. Back then, ships were held together with these heavy copper bolts and nails. When those ships were broken down at the docks, or when houses were built near the river, those nails ended up in the muck. You could pull dozens of them out of the sewer walls in a single shift. They were easy to find, easy to carry, and every scrap dealer in the city would buy them from you for cash. But the real prizes were the household items. You'd be scraping your hoe through a pile of sludge, and suddenly you'd hear a clink. You'd reach down and pull out a silver spoon or a piece of a lady's jewelry, maybe a silver thimble that slipped off a finger during a wash. These items were high value. One good silver spoon could pay for your food and your room for a whole week. Then you had the coins, shillings, pennies, and if it was a lucky day, a gold sovereign. These coins didn't just sit on top of the mud. They got buried. You had to learn how to read the flow of the water. You looked for the spots where the tunnel turned or where the brickwork was uneven. That's where the heavy stuff got trapped. It was like panning for gold, but instead of a mountain stream, you were working in the city's gut. Now, you couldn't just walk into a bank with a pocket full of muddy silver and expect to get paid. The police were a massive problem for these guys. See, the city claimed that everything inside the sewers belonged to the government. If you were down there, you were technically a thief. If a cop saw a guy covered in sewer grime trying to sell a silver watch at a pawn shop, he'd put him in handcuffs before he could even open his mouth. So the toshers had to be smart. They used a network of what people called dolly shops or marine store dealers. These were the bottom-tier scrap yards in the roughest parts of town. The owners of these shops didn't care about the law. They didn't ask you where you got a handful of copper nails or a bent silver fork. You'd walk in, dump your bag on the scale, and they'd give you a price. It was always less than the item was actually worth, but it was fast, and it was anonymous. The scrap dealer would take your silver spoons and throw them into a melting pot right then and there. Once that spoon was melted down into a shapeless lump of metal, the evidence was gone. No cop could prove it was stolen. The dealer would then sell the raw metal to a legitimate refinery, and everyone got their cut. It was a perfect system for moving stolen goods without ever leaving a paper trail. But you didn't just walk into a sewer alone and start digging. That was a good way to disappear. The underground was ruled by a very strict hierarchy. You had the gangs. These weren't like street gangs looking for fights. These were business units. Usually, a gang was made up of 3 or 4 men. Most of the time, they were all from the same family. You'd have a father and his sons, or a group of brothers. They did this for 2 reasons. First, you had to trust the people you were with. If you found a gold coin, you needed to know your partner wasn't going to hit you over the head and take it for himself. Second, you needed a team to survive the environment. One guy would be the leader. He'd be the one at the front with the pole, testing the ground to make sure you didn't fall into a deep pit or get swept away by a sudden rush of water. The younger guys would be behind him with the bags and the hose, doing the heavy digging. They'd pick a specific set of tunnels and they'd defend them. If a new guy tried to start digging in a gang's territory, there'd be a fight. It was about protecting the source. They knew which tunnels were the most profitable. They knew which ones sat under the wealthy neighborhoods where the good stuff came from. You stayed in your lane, you did the work, and you looked out for each other. The older toshers were like the kings of the neighborhood. They knew the tides. They knew the smells that meant a pocket of deadly gas was about to blow. They even knew how to hide from the police patrols. When the city started sending sewer hunters down to arrest people, the toshers would just blow out their lanterns and sit in the pitch black, perfectly still. They knew the tunnels so well they could navigate them by touch. The police would walk right past them, and as soon as the light faded, the toshers went back to work. The result of all this was a strange, hidden economy that ran right beneath the feet of the rich. While a businessman was walking to his office, 30 feet below him, a man was pulling a silver coin out of the mud that the businessman's wife had dropped a week ago. That coin would be sold by noon, melted by dinner, and the tosher would be sitting in a pub by midnight, spending the money. They were taking the things the city had rejected and turning them back into wealth. They were the ultimate recyclers, but they were doing it in a world where one wrong step meant you never saw the sun again. They didn't care about the dirt or the danger. They only cared about what was trapped in the walls. And as long as London kept growing, there was always more treasure to find. But the thing you have to realize is that treasure meant different things to different people. While some guys were looking for a lost wedding ring or a silver spoon in the muck, other guys were looking for something that could bite your finger off. I'm talking about the rats. And I'm not just talking about a few mice in the attic. I'm talking about a city that was basically built on top of a mountain of fur and teeth. Back then, London was a mess. It was crowded, it was dirty, and it was the perfect home for the brown rat. These things were everywhere. They were in the sewers, obviously, But they were also in the walls of every slum and under the floorboards of the nicest houses in town. Some people who lived there said there were more rats in London than there were people. Think about that. You couldn't walk down a street at night without hearing them scratching around. They ate the trash, they ate the food in the pantries, and sometimes, if a person was sick or old, they'd even try to take a bite out of them. It was a literal plague. Now, when you have a problem that big, someone is going to figure out how to make a buck off it. That's where the rat catchers came in. These guys were the unofficial kings of the London streets. But there was one guy who stood out from the rest. His name was Jack Black. You would have known him if you saw him. He didn't try to hide what he did. In fact, he dressed like a total showman. He wore these tight leather breeches, a bright red waistcoat, and a huge gold-colored belt. And get this, the belt was decorated with solid brass rats. He even had a sign on his house that said he was the official rat destroyer for Queen Victoria herself. And it wasn't a lie. The Queen actually hired him to keep the rats out of her palaces, because even royalty couldn't escape the vermin. Jack Black didn't just use traps, he had a whole system. He used ferrets and small dogs, specifically terriers. Here is how he'd do it. He would find a hole where the rats were hiding, maybe in a basement or a sewer entrance. He'd take one of his ferrets, he liked the white ones because they were easier to see in the dark, and he'd put a little muzzle on it. He didn't want the ferret to kill the rat underground where he couldn't get to it. He just wanted the ferret to scare the rat out. The ferret would go down into the dark, and the rats would lose their minds. They'd bolt out of the exit holes to get away. But waiting at every exit was one of Jack's dogs. These were small, scrappy little dogs like Jack Russell's. They were fast, they were mean, and they could snap a rat's neck in a split second. It was a fast, bloody business. Jack would stand there, grabbing the rats his dogs didn't kill, often using his bare hands. He didn't care about getting bitten. He actually used to show off his scars to people to prove how tough he was. But here's where the story gets interesting. Being the Queen's rat catcher paid the bills, but Jack was a businessman. He knew that a dead rat was only worth whatever the city or the Queen would pay him to get rid of it. But a live rat was worth a lot more. See, while the upper class was going to the theater or the opera, the working class in London had a different kind of entertainment. They went to underground pubs for something called rat baiting. It was a blood sport, plain and simple. They'd have a big wooden pit in the middle of a crowded, smoky bar. People would bet their hard-earned money on how fast a dog could kill a certain number of rats. Jack saw an opportunity here. When he was out on his jobs, he didn't kill every rat he found. He'd keep the biggest, meanest, and nastiest ones alive. He'd toss them into a big cage he carried around. This was his illegal side hustle. He'd take these live rats to the pub owners who ran the fighting pits. These pub owners needed a constant supply of fresh rats. If you have a dog that can kill 100 rats in 10 minutes, you need a lot of rats to keep the show going. Jack was the main supplier. He would sell these rats by the dozen. Think about the irony of that. The man hired by the government to clean up the city was actually keeping the rat population alive in cages just so he could sell them back to the public for entertainment. It was a perfect circle of money. He'd get paid to catch them, then he'd get paid to sell them. The money in these pits was huge. People would pack into these tiny, stinking rooms, screaming and cheering while a terrier went to work. It was a brutal way to make a living, but in the Victorian slums, you didn't judge a guy for how he put food on the table. Jack Black became a bit of a celebrity because of it. He was the guy who provided the talent for the Friday night fights. He even started breeding rats. If he found a rat with a weird color, like a white one or a spotted one, he'd keep it and try to grow more of them. It sounds crazy to us now, but he was basically the first guy to turn a pest into a pet. But his bread and butter was always the fighting pits. He had to be careful, though. The police didn't always look kindly on the gambling side of things, even if they were happy the rats were off the streets. Jack had to move his cages in the middle of the night, dodging the patrols to get his cargo to the back doors of the pubs. If he got caught with a bag full of live rats, it was hard to explain that he was just doing his job for the Queen. But Jack was smart. He knew the tunnels better than anyone. He knew which alleys were safe and which cops could be bought with a few coins or a bottle of gin. He ran this secret economy for years, turning a citywide disaster into a personal fortune. He was a man who saw a city drowning in filth and decided to start charging admission. Every time a dog won a fight in one of those pits, Jack Black made money. Every time a rat bit a hole in a rich man's pantry, Jack Black made money. He lived in the middle of the mess, and he loved it. He didn't just catch rats, he managed them. He treated the sewers like his own private warehouse, and as long as the city kept producing trash, the rats would keep breeding, and Jack would keep getting rich. It wasn't just about the hunt for him. It was about the power of knowing that the city couldn't survive without him. He was the guy who stood between London and the vermin, but he was also the guy making sure the vermin stayed exactly where he wanted them. He was a showman, a hunter, and a black market dealer, all rolled into one. And he did it all while wearing a belt made of brass rats, just to remind everyone who the boss really was. While the other sewer workers were digging through the mud for pennies, Jack was building an empire out of the things everyone else was running away from. He proved that if you were brave enough to reach into the dark, you could pull out a lot more than just a handful of dirt. You could pull out a business that the entire city, from the Queen to the lowest gambler, was forced to support. That business was about to hit a massive, disgusting wall. See, you have to understand what London was like in the middle of the 1800s. It wasn't just a city, it was a pressure cooker. 2.5 million people were all living on top of each other, and all those people had to go to the bathroom. For a long time, they just used cesspools. Basically, that's just a giant hole under the house. When it got full, you paid a guy to shovel it out at night. But then the flush toilet started getting popular. Suddenly, instead of a hole that needed shoveling, you had a constant stream of water pushing all that waste into the old crumbling pipes under the streets. Those pipes weren't designed for that. They were originally made to carry rain away so the streets wouldn't flood. They all led to one place, the River Thames. So, by the 1850s, the river wasn't really a river anymore. It was a slow-moving, open-air sewer that cut right through the heart of the biggest city on Earth. It was thick, brown, and full of everything you can imagine. And then came the summer of 1858. It started in June. The sun came out, and it just didn't go away. This wasn't a normal summer heat. It was a record-breaking heat wave. The temperature in the shade hit 90 degrees, which was almost unheard of for London. The air stayed dead still. No wind came through to clear things out. And because it didn't rain for weeks, the water level in the Thames started to drop. Now, think about what happens when a river dries up. The water pulls back from the banks. In London, that meant the water pulled back to reveal the floor of the river along the edges. But it wasn't sand or rocks down there. It was a thick, black, bubbling crust of human waste. In some places, it was 6 feet deep, and now, for the first time in years, it was sitting right there in the open, exposed to the direct heat of a boiling sun. The sun basically turned the Thames into a giant frying pan. It baked that waste. It cooked it until it started to ferment and bubble up with gas. The smell that came off that river wasn't just a bad odor. It was a physical force. People who lived through it described it as a thick, invisible fog that you could almost taste. It spread out from the riverbanks and crawled into every alleyway and every bedroom in the city. You couldn't escape it. You could be a rich merchant in a mansion or a poor kid in a basement, and you were still breathing the same rotten air. People started panicking. Back then, everyone believed in something called miasma. They thought bad smells were actually the thing that carried diseases like cholera or the plague. So when the city started to stink like a graveyard, people didn't just think it was gross. They thought they were literally breathing in their own death. They stayed inside. They covered their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in expensive perfume. Nothing worked. The smell was everywhere. But the real drama happened at the center of power. The Houses of Parliament sit right on the north bank of the Thames. I mean, the building is practically dipping its toes in the water. And the politicians inside had been ignoring the sewer problem for years. They didn't want to spend the money.
They'd been warned that the river was a ticking time bomb, but they kept putting it off because it was going to cost a fortune to fix. They'd sit in their fancy chairs, talking about budgets and taxes, while the river outside just got worse and worse. In June of 1858, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The heat wave cooked the mud right outside their windows. The smell became so intense that lawmakers started getting sick during meetings. They tried to fight back. They went to the windows and hung up heavy curtains made of canvas. They soaked these curtains in a chemical called chloride of lime. The idea was that the chemical would catch the smell and neutralize it before it got inside the room. It was a total disaster. The chemical smell mixed with the rotting river smell and created something even worse. It was a stinging, sour, heavy stench that made your eyes water and your throat close up. One day, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the guy in charge of the country's money, walked into a committee room with a pile of papers. He took one breath, turned around, and walked right back out with a handkerchief over his nose. He told his colleagues he couldn't work in those conditions. Nobody could. The library in the Parliament building became a ghost town. The lawmakers tried to go there to study or write, but the smell was so thick they had to run out within minutes. They were gagging, they were dizzy, they were terrified. These were the men who ran the British Empire, the most powerful government on the planet, and they were being defeated by a pile of hot garbage in a river. Things got so bad that they actually started talking about moving the entire government. They seriously considered packing up and moving to a town called Oxford or somewhere else far away out in the country. They thought about abandoning London entirely just to get away from the stink. They even brought in a bill to legally move the law courts out of the city because the judges and lawyers couldn't think straight. Every time a boat went past on the river, it churned up the water and released a fresh cloud of the stuff. Imagine trying to give a speech about the future of the nation while your stomach is doing somersaults and your eyes are burning. One member of Parliament even reported seeing his colleagues clutching their stomachs and rushing for the exits. It wasn't just a political crisis, it was a physical emergency. The smell was so aggressive it felt like it was attacking you. Finally, the pressure got to be too much. They realized that if they didn't do something, the city was going to stop working. They couldn't run away forever. They had to face the mess they'd been ignoring. In late July, when the heat was at its absolute worst, they stopped arguing about the cost. They threw out the old plans and the slow committees. They realized that the Great Stink was a bigger threat than any war. They stayed in those smelly rooms just long enough to pass a law. The law gave a man named Joseph Bazalgette the power to completely rebuild the guts of the city. They didn't do it because they cared about the poor people in the slums. They didn't do it because they wanted to be heroes. They did it because they couldn't breathe. They did it because the smell of their own neglect had finally become too loud to ignore.
Once that law passed, the lawmakers didn't stick around to celebrate. They fled. They got out of London as fast as their carriages could take them. They headed for the countryside, where the air was clean. They left the city to rot in the sun, while a massive plan started to take shape behind the scenes. The era of just throwing things in the river was over, but the work to fix it was going to be the biggest engineering project the world had ever seen. It all started because a few hundred powerful men finally got a whiff of what the rest of the city had been living with for years. So those guys in Parliament finally realized they couldn't live in a giant toilet anymore. But here is the thing about the government back then. Once they decided to fix a problem, they didn't just want to build pipes. They wanted to own the whole thing. They wanted total control. Before the big engineering project started, the sewers were basically a free-for-all. If you were brave enough or desperate enough to crawl down there, whatever you found was yours. But the powerful men in charge decided that had to stop. They looked at the toshers and didn't see people trying to make a living. They saw a nuisance. They saw a group of people who knew the city's secrets better than they did, and they didn't like it one bit. So they did what the government does best. They passed a law. In 1840, they made it a flat-out crime to enter any sewer in London without a formal permit. Now you have to understand, these permits weren't for the guys in rags with lanterns strapped to their chests. They were for official inspectors and builders. For the toshers, this law was a death sentence for their way of life. Suddenly, the sewer hunters were just plain old criminals. The law said that if you were caught down there, you could be fined £5. That doesn't sound like much today, does it? But back then, £5 was a fortune. It was more than most families earned in months. If you couldn't pay, you didn't just walk away. You went to prison. You did hard labor. You lost everything. But a law is just words on a piece of paper if nobody's there to back it up. The government knew this, so they didn't just pass the law and hope for the best. They sent in the police. This is where things got really tough for the workers. The Metropolitan Police started setting up actual patrols. They didn't just walk the streets, they watched the riverbanks. They knew exactly where the big sewer mouths opened up into the Thames. They started stationing officers at these grates. Think about that. You spend your whole day wading through knee-deep filth, hoping to find a bit of scrap metal, and when you finally crawl out into the fresh air, there's a guy in a blue coat waiting to slap handcuffs on you. The city went even further. They started locking the grates. They put heavy iron bars over the entrances and used massive locks that a regular guy couldn't pick. They also started patrolling the streets above. They'd look for anyone who looked a bit too dirty or smelled a bit too much like a drain. If you were walking home with a bag of loot and a copper saw you, that was it. you were headed for the station. The government was trying to starve these guys out. They wanted the sewers to be a closed system, no outsiders allowed. Now, if you think these guys just gave up and went to look for factory jobs, you don't know the Toshers. These were some of the toughest people in the world. They had been working these tunnels for generations. They knew the layout of the city better than the people who built the maps. They weren't going to let a few locks and some guys with clubs stop them from feeding their kids. They just changed how they worked. They became ghosts. The first thing they did was give up the daytime shift. It was way too risky to be seen near a sewer grate when the sun was up, so they became creatures of the night. They'd wait until the city went quiet and the streets were dark. They'd find a manhole cover in a back alley or a side street where the police didn't usually go. They didn't just lift the lids either. They had these specialized tools, like heavy iron bars, that they used to pop the covers silently. They'd slide down into the dark, and the last guy in would pull the lid back over his head. Just like that, they'd vanish. They'd spend the whole night underground, working by the light of a tiny candle, and they'd have to be out and gone before the sun came up. But even then, the police were everywhere. So the Toshers got creative. They started using the secret economy to their advantage. Look, the policemen back then weren't making much money. They were cold, they were tired, and they were often just as poor as the people they were chasing. The Toshers knew this. If a copper caught you coming out of a grate, you didn't always end up in jail. Sometimes you just handed over a piece of what you found. A silver spoon, a few copper coins, or even just enough money for a few pints of beer. That was often enough to make a policeman look the other way. It became a whole system of bribes. They'd have a little stash of coins ready just in case they ran into trouble. Some of the more successful Toshers even had regular arrangements with specific officers. They'd pay them a set amount every week to make sure a certain alleyway was left unguarded at 2 a.m. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the mice were getting really good at outsmarting the cat. They also started working in bigger groups for protection. Before the crackdown, a guy might go down alone or with a partner, but once it became a crime, they started moving in packs. If a lone guard tried to stop a group of 6 or 7 Toshers, he might think twice. These guys were armed with heavy poles, and they weren't afraid to use them. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. But this new way of working had a dark side. Because they were hiding from the law, they had to take way more risks. When the job was legal, you could take your time. You could wait for the tide to go out safely. You could stay in the bigger, safer tunnels. But when you're worried about a police patrol, you're in a rush. You're taking shortcuts. You're going into the smaller, crumbling pipes just to stay out of sight. This was pockets of gas that could kill a man in seconds or explode if a candle got too close. But they did it anyway, because a dangerous tunnel was better than a prison cell. The government thought they were cleaning up the city and making it more professional. In reality, they just pushed a whole community into the shadows and made a dangerous job 10 times more lethal. The Toshers didn't stop, and the secret economy didn't disappear. It just went deeper. It turned honest scavengers into outlaws who had to bribe their way through the night. The city above was changing, getting cleaner and more organized, but down below, the battle for the city's trash was becoming a war.
And the Toshers were winning. One bribe and one midnight manhole cover at a time. They stayed down there, right under the feet of the men who made the laws, proving that as long as there was something valuable in the dirt, someone would be there to dig it out.
But digging for scraps only gets you so far when the very ground you're standing on is soaked in rot. Those scavengers were just picking at the edges of a much bigger problem. By the middle of the 1800s, London wasn't just messy, it was broken. The city was basically a giant open-air toilet that didn't flush. Every time someone used a bucket or a hole in the ground, it eventually made its way into the Thames, and that was the same water people were drinking. It was a cycle of death that the city leaders just couldn't ignore anymore. The smell got so bad that they literally couldn't work in the Houses of Parliament without holding handkerchiefs to their noses. They knew they had to fix it, but they didn't have a clue how to handle a project this big. They needed someone who could see the whole city as one big machine. That's when Joseph Bazalgette stepped up. Bazalgette wasn't a guy who looked for the spotlight. He was an engineer through and through. He was the kind of person who obsessed over every little detail. He spent years drawing up maps and looking at the way the land sloped toward the river. He knew that you couldn't just add more small pipes. You had to change the entire flow of the city. He came up with a blueprint that was so big it scared people. He wanted to build 82 miles of main sewers. Now, that doesn't sound like much today, but back then it was like saying you wanted to build a road to the moon. These weren't just pipes, they were massive brick tunnels, big enough for a train to drive through. His plan was to catch all the waste in these big intercepting lines before it ever reached the river, and then use gravity to pull it all the way out to the east of the city. This wasn't something you could do quietly. To build these sewers, Bazalgette had to rip London apart. Think about the busiest streets you know. Now imagine a crew of thousands showing up and digging a hole right down the middle of them. They weren't just digging a little trench for a cable. They were digging canyons. They had to move millions of tons of earth, and they didn't have any of the machines we have now. No backhoes, no bulldozers, no power drills. It was all done by hand. I'm talking about thousands of men with shovels and picks working 10-hour shifts in the mud. These guys were called navvies. They were the muscle behind the whole operation. They lived hard lives, sleeping in shacks and moving from one dig site to the next. They dug through old graveyards, through thick clay, and through the foundations of buildings that had been there for hundreds of years. But digging the hole was only half the battle. Once you had the space, you had to build the tunnel. Bazalgette was obsessed with quality because he knew that if these tunnels failed, the whole city would sink back into the muck. He chose a specific kind of material called Portland cement. Back then, it was a brand new thing. Most builders didn't trust it. They thought it was too expensive or too hard to work with. But Bazalgette knew it was the only thing that would hold up against the constant flow of water and waste. He was so strict about it that he set up a testing lab. Every single batch of cement that came onto the job site had to be tested. If it didn't meet his standards, he sent it back. He didn't care if it slowed things down. He wanted these sewers to last for centuries. And then there were the bricks. To build 82 miles of tunnels that are big enough to walk in, you need a lot of bricks. The final count was around 318 million. Just think about that number for a second. Every single one of those bricks had to be made in a kiln, loaded onto a cart or a barge, brought into the city, and then laid by hand. You had bricklayers working deep underground by the light of a few candles, laying row after row after row. They had to get the curve of the tunnel perfectly right so the structure wouldn't collapse under the weight of the city above it. If they messed up the angle by even an inch, the whole thing could come crashing down. One of the craziest parts of the project was the Victoria Embankment. Bazalgette didn't just dig under the streets, he decided to actually move the river. He built a massive stone wall along the edge of the Thames and filled in the space behind it with earth. This did two things. First, it gave him a clear path to lay his biggest sewer pipes without having to tear down thousands of houses. Second, it created a brand new road and a park on top. He was literally reshaping the map of London to make room for his pipes. It was a massive engineering gamble, but it worked. He buried the sewers, the gas lines, and even the start of the underground train system all in one go. But even with all those miles of brick and cement, gravity can only do so much. London is pretty flat, and eventually the waste would just stop moving. Bazalgette knew he had to give it a push. That's why he built the pumping stations. These weren't just ugly utility buildings. He built them to look like palaces. If you saw them today, you'd think they were cathedrals or mansions. He put ornate ironwork and beautiful stonework on them because he wanted the public to be proud of the work. Inside these buildings were the real stars, massive steam engines. These were some of the biggest machines ever built at the time. They had giant beams that would swing up and down, powering pumps that could lift thousands of gallons of sewage every minute. They would pull the waste up from the low-lying sewers and dump it into higher tunnels so it could keep flowing toward the sea. The noise inside those stations must have been deafening. You had coal being shoveled into furnaces, steam hissing from the pipes, and the constant thud of the pumps. It was the heartbeat of the city. Without those engines running, the whole system would have backed up in hours. Bazalgette had created a giant artificial river hidden right under everyone's feet. It was a masterpiece of planning. He even insisted on making the pipes twice as big as they needed to be for the population at the time. His bosses complained that he was wasting money. They told him he was being over the top, but he stood his ground. He told them that London was going to grow, and if they didn't build for the future, they'd be right back in the same mess in 20 years. Because he was so stubborn, he saved the city. The population doubled, and then it doubled again, and those sewers handled it all. He took a city that was literally dying from its own filth and turned it into the most modern place on earth. It took years of sweat, millions of bricks, and more money than anyone thought possible. But by the time they were done, the great stink was gone. The river started to clean itself up. People stopped dying of cholera by the thousands. It wasn't just a construction project. It was the moment London finally grew up. And it was all built on the backs of men who spent their lives digging in the dark, laying one brick at a time until the job was done. But here's the thing about those bricks. They didn't just build a new city. They built a wall between the rich and the people who lived off their waste. Those men who laid the bricks were basically building their own coffin, at least when it came to their way of making a living. You have to understand that before this big construction project, the sewers were like a wild frontier. They were messy, they were dangerous, but they were open. If you were brave enough to crawl into a hole in the riverbank, the treasure, or the tosh, was yours for the taking. But once the new system was finished, that whole world just stopped. It didn't fade away slowly. It was cut off. The man behind the plan, Joseph Bazalgette, wasn't thinking about the scavengers when he drew his maps. He wanted to save London from the smell and the cholera, and he did a great job at that. but his new design was a nightmare for the toshers. See, the old sewers were basically just ancient streams that people had built houses over. They had big, crumbling openings. You could just walk right in at low tide. But the new pipes, they were different. They were made of hard, smooth brick and iron. Most importantly, they were sealed. I want you to imagine being a tosher named Jack. You've spent 15 years waking up when the tide goes out, grabbing your lantern and your pole and heading down to your favorite spot by the Thames. You know exactly which tunnel leads to the fancy parts of town where the rich people drop their jewelry down the drains. You get to your spot, but the hole is gone. In its place, there's a massive stone wall. You walk further down the bank, looking for any way in, but all you see are these heavy iron grates. They aren't just there to catch trash. They're bolted down. They're built to keep things out, and that includes you. These new pipes didn't have those nice, easy access points anymore. The city started installing these things called intercepting sewers. Instead of everything flowing straight into the river where any guy with a lantern could find it, the waste was now diverted into massive, high-speed tunnels that ran parallel to the water. These tunnels were deep, they were fast, and they were completely out of reach. If you tried to get into one of those, the sheer force of the water would probably kill you in seconds. The secret economy of the underground was basically hit with a giant no trespassing sign that covered the entire city. So what do you do when your entire job disappears overnight? You can't go to the police and complain that the government ruined your scavenging business. Scavenging was technically illegal anyway, even if everyone looked the other way for decades. The toshers were suddenly stuck on the surface, and London wasn't a kind place for people without a trade. They were looking at a city that was modernizing fast. The old, chaotic London was being replaced by a place that liked order and rules. A lot of these guys tried to find regular work, but it wasn't easy. You have to remember, these men were used to being their own bosses. They worked in the dark, they worked when they wanted, and they made decent money, sometimes more than a skilled laborer. Now they were standing in line at the factory gates. I'm talking about the big ironworks and the textile mills. These places were loud, they were hot, and the bosses treated you like a part of the machine. For a guy who spent his life navigating the quiet, dark tunnels, the noise of a factory floor must have been a special kind of hell. The pay was a shock, too. In the sewers, one lucky find, a gold ring or a heavy silver spoon, could pay for a week's worth of food and beer. In a factory, you worked 12 hours a day just to buy a loaf of bread and a cramped room in a tenement. A good chunk of the former toshers just couldn't hack it. They weren't built for the clock-in, clock-out lifestyle. Their lungs were already messed up from years of breathing in sewer gas, and the soot and smoke of the factories didn't help. Then there was the other group. These were the guys who couldn't get a factory job, maybe because they were too old or too sick from their years underground. For them, the end of the sewer economy meant the end of their independence entirely. When the money ran out and you couldn't pay the rent, there was only one place left to go, the workhouse. Now, if you haven't heard of a Victorian workhouse, just know it was the closest thing to a prison you could get into without actually committing a crime. The government made them as miserable as possible on purpose. They didn't want people to rely on the system, so they made the help feel like a punishment. If you ended up there, the first thing they did was take your clothes. They'd give you a rough, itchy uniform. If you had a wife or kids, they'd split you up. You lived in different wings and maybe saw each other once a week if the guards were feeling nice. This wasn't useful work. It was just something to keep you busy and tired. You might spend 10 hours a day breaking rocks with a hammer or unraveling old tar-covered ropes until your fingers bled. It was soul-crushing to go from the freedom of the sewers, where you were a sort of king of the dark, to a place where you had to ask permission to sit down. It broke a lot of these men. Some of the younger, luckier ones found a middle ground. The city realized that even though the new sewers were high-tech, they still needed maintenance. They needed people who weren't afraid of the dark and knew how to move in the sludge. These were official employees who wore uniforms and cleared blockages. Some former toshers took these jobs. It was the same work, but the soul was gone. You didn't get to keep what you found anymore. If you found a coin, you were supposed to hand it over. You were no longer a treasure hunter. You were a janitor in a suit. By the time the 1870s rolled around, the classic London tosher was basically a ghost story. The heavy iron grates and the new concrete embankments had won. The city had effectively paved over its own history, and in the process, it wiped out an entire class of people who had survived on the crumbs of the wealthy. The gold and silver were still flowing under the streets, but now they were trapped behind millions of tons of taxpayer-funded brickwork. The secret economy didn't just shrink, it was locked in a vault, and the key was thrown away. London was cleaner, sure. The river didn't smell like a literal toilet anymore. But for the men who knew the city's belly better than anyone else, the price of that progress was everything they had. They were forced out of the shadows and into a world that didn't have a place for them anymore.
So the old-timers were out. The new brick tunnels were too deep, too fast, and way too guarded for them to keep working. These guys didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their whole world. But while they were wandering the streets looking for a way to survive, the rest of London was finally catching a break. For a long time, everyone thought you got sick from breathing bad air. They called it miasma, which is really just a fancy way of saying stinky mist. They were dead wrong. It was the water that was killing them. Once the new sewer system started pulling all that human waste away from the wells and the riverbanks where people got their drinking water, things changed fast. Let's look at the numbers. In 1866, there was one last big scare. Cholera hit the East End hard. But because of those new pipes, the disease didn't wipe out the whole city like it used to. After that, the death rate didn't just dip, it fell off a cliff. By the time the 1870s rolled around, those massive cholera outbreaks that used to kill thousands of people in a single month were basically gone. It's hard to wrap your head around how big of a deal that was. It was like a giant weight being lifted off the entire city. People finally stopped looking at a cup of water like it was a loaded gun. But you have to remember, the River Thames didn't just turn blue and clear overnight. You can't just flip a switch on 40 miles of thick sludge. For years, the river had been a black soup of everything you don't want to think about. Even after the new pipes started carrying the fresh waste further out to sea, the old junk was still there, sitting on the bottom. It took the natural movement of the tides a long time to do the heavy lifting. We're talking about 20 years of the ocean pushing in and pulling out before the riverbed actually got clean. If you stood on the London Bridge in 1880, it didn't smell like a literal toilet anymore. The great stink was finally a memory. The water wasn't perfect, but it wasn't a death trap either. Now, think about the street finders, the guys like the toshers and the mudlarks. These were the people who made a living off the things Londoners dropped or threw away. They were the original recyclers. As the city got cleaner, their treasure disappeared. The new sewers were like a fortress. You couldn't just pop a manhole cover and climb down for a look around anymore. The police were on the lookout, and the new government board had everything locked down tight with heavy iron grates and keys. These guys were aging out, too. If you'd spent 30 years waist deep in filth, your body was going to pay the price eventually. Their lungs were ruined from breathing in sewer gas for decades. Their bones were stiff and sore from the constant damp. By the late 1800s, the famous toshers were mostly just old men. They couldn't climb the ladders anymore. They couldn't run from the cops. They ended up working on the surface, picking through the trash heaps at the docks or trying to find bits of scrap metal in the gutters. There was no retirement plan for a sewer hunter. Most of them ended their days in the workhouse.
That was a place where the city put the poor and the elderly to work in exchange for a bed and a bowl of thin soup. It was a lonely, quiet end for a group of people who used to be the kings of the dark. The city moved on. The air got cleaner, and the people who knew the old London best simply faded away. They were the human cost of a modern city, and by the turn of the century, they were gone.
But those people didn't just disappear into thin air. Even though the workers are gone, the world they built is still right beneath your feet. If you're walking through London today, you're likely standing on top of the exact same bricks Joseph Bazalgette laid down in the 1860s. He didn't just build a sewer system to fix a temporary smell. He built it to last forever. Most people today build things to break, so you have to buy a new one in 5 years. Bazalgette did the opposite. He looked at how much waste the city made, and then he doubled the size of the pipes. He used over 300 million bricks and the strongest cement he could find. Because of that, his tunnels are still doing the heavy lifting for millions of people every single day. We've got smartphones and satellites now, but we still rely on Victorian plumbing to keep the city running. There is one big thing that changed, though. It's how you and I look at our trash. Today, we have a very simple system. You finish a bag of chips or a bottle of water, and you throw the leftovers in a bin. You don't think about it again. To us, trash is a problem. It's something gross that we pay the government to take away and hide in a hole in the ground. We throw away clothes because they have a tiny hole. We throw away food because the date on the box says so. We are a toss-it-out society. But for a Victorian, that way of thinking would have been crazy. Everything had a price tag. They didn't recycle because they wanted to be green or save the ocean. They did it because they were hungry. If you found a dry bone in the gutter, you didn't leave it there. You picked it up and sold it to a guy who would grind it into fertilizer or boil it down for glue. If you found a scrap of old rope, you sold it to be turned into paper. Even the dog poop on the sidewalk was worth money. People called pure finders would collect it in buckets and sell it to tanneries to help soften leather. Every single thing the city coughed up was caught by someone looking to make a penny. Think about the sheer scale of that. You had thousands of people who woke up every single morning with nothing. No job, no boss, and no paycheck. Their only way to eat was to head out into the muck and find what the rest of the city threw away. The mudlarks stayed by the river, the toshers went into the pipes, and the bone grubbers walked the alleys. They were the city's unofficial cleaning crew. They didn't have fancy tools. They had their hands and a few sacks. They took the filth of the rich and turned it into the survival of the poor. It was a hard, brutal way to live. It was dangerous and it smelled terrible, but it worked. These people took a city that was drowning in its own waste and they processed it by hand. They turned junk into cash. By the time they were done with a pile of rubbish, there was absolutely nothing left.
London didn't just grow because of bankers and kings. It grew because of the people who knew how to find value in the dark. So, next time you walk over a manhole cover, just remember what's down there.
The tunnels are still there. The bricks are still there. And the story of how a city survived on its own scraps is still written in the walls. They proved that even in the middle of the mess, there was always a way to make a living if you were willing to get your hands dirty.